The Cape Flats area on the outskirts of Cape Town, South Africa, is a harsh world. It's an area plagued by poverty, gangs, and substance abuse issues. Located on the low-lying flatlands southeast of the city center, neighborhoods like Valhalla Park and Heinz Park are home to both ordinary families trying to make the most of the circumstances and dangerous gangs who compete for money, power, and control. It's against this backdrop that a young man named Cameron Wilson came of age. Even though he was only 17 years old at the time, Cameron embarked on a reign of terror that would leave the communities of the Cape Flats living in fear. Possessing a cold-blooded ruthlessness far beyond his years, Cameron showed no mercy as he raped, murdered, and assaulted dozens in just a few short years. The young killer demonstrated a complete lack of remorse for even his most gruesome crimes. Attacking without warning or provocation, Cameron demonstrated no pattern or preference for his violence. His victims ranged across gender, ages, and had no clear connections. He killed both impulsively and also with drawn-out torture, murdering for money, for power, or just his own cruel enjoyment. With a killer instinct seemingly coursing through his veins, Cameron had the potential to become one of the most notorious serial killers and violent offenders South Africa had ever seen. Cameron Wilson committed his first known attack in October 2014 that would set off a string of violent crimes. On this day, 17-year-old Cameron had ended up violently stabbing a man named Alfonso van Rooyen to death, following a loud confrontation between the two. On the day of the incident, 22-year-old Alfonso was walking through a winding street in Valhalla Park, heading to visit his grandmother. Though the neighborhood could be dangerous, it was a path Alfonso took nearly every day without incident. But on that day, residents peered out their windows at the sound of shouting in the street below. They witnessed Cameron striding quickly to catch up to Alfonso, grab him by the shoulder, and spin him around. Without hesitation, Cameron plunged a knife deep into Alfonso's chest, leaving him to bleed out on the sidewalk. Although the attack was witnessed by several members of the public, most were too afraid to come forward. This was because Cameron's father was a prominent member of the 28's prison gang, one of the most notorious and dangerous prison gangs in South Africa. Witnesses feared retaliation from not only Cameron, but also his father and other members of the gang. This fear was not unfounded, as just 3 days after Alfonso's murder, Toya Stauber, a man who had witnessed Cameron murdering Alfonso, was shot dead. Toya Stauber was a well-respected member of the community and ran a shop from his home with his wife. He was known to be a hard-working and honest man who was dedicated to providing for his family. He kept to himself and didn't know Cameron or what he was capable of. On the day of his death, Toya had noticed Cameron Wilson entering his store. He had recognized Cameron as the man who had murdered Alfonso 3 days earlier, so not wanting to have anything to do with him, Toya asked Cameron to leave his shop. This led to a verbal altercation outside the store, and Cameron eventually fled on foot, with Toya following behind in his car, presumably to figure out where Cameron lived so that he could call the police. However, just a few minutes after Toya had got into his car and started following Cameron Wilson, neighbors came rushing to inform Stauber's wife that her husband had been shot dead just down the road. Witnesses told his wife that it was Cameron who had shot Toya, but once again, no one was willing to provide a statement to police or testify against Cameron Wilson out of fear of retaliation. The police struggled to build a case against Cameron due to the lack of cooperation from witnesses. This lack of accountability allowed Cameron to continue his violent crimes without consequence. This culture of silence and fear perhaps emboldened his brutal instincts even more. And for many in the Cape Flats, the worst was yet to come. Emboldened by his ability to evade punishment for his first 2 murders, over the next 2 years, Cameron Wilson descended into a spree of horrific violence and depravity. The Cape Flats community lived in fear as again and again Cameron attacked without warning, remorse, or hesitation. In December 2014, just 2 months after killing Toya Stauber, Cameron murdered 20-year-old Ernest Erasmus in a chilling attack on Christmas Day. Ernest had been visiting a tavern in Heinz Park, Cape Town with his girlfriend, where they purchased a small bag of cannabis before heading home. However, they soon realized they had dropped the bag somewhere along the way. Retracing their steps back to the tavern, the couple searched the street to recover their drugs. It was at this moment that Cameron appeared, riding up suddenly on his bicycle. He demanded money from Ernest, but when Ernest insisted he had nothing to give, Cameron ruthlessly pulled out a screwdriver and plunged it into Ernest's neck. leaving his victim to bleed out on the sidewalk while Cameron pedaled quickly away from the scene. 4 months later, in April 2015, Cameron's violent spree continued as he attacked 2 more victims in separate incidents. The first was 20-year-old Cody Philander, who was walking with a friend when Cameron approached them and demanded to look inside Cody's backpack. When Cody refused, Cameron became enraged and pulled out a knife, stabbing Cody in the chest before he fled the scene. Despite being critically injured, Cody Philander survived the attack. Later that same month, 17-year-old Dorney Davids became another one of Cameron's victims. Dorney had been visiting a friend and was walking home alone across an open field when she bumped into Cameron's cousin. She knew Cameron's cousin from the area, and the two were friends, so Dorney thought she had no reason to be fearful. The two started chatting as they walked across the field, and nothing seemed out of the ordinary. That is, until Cameron himself suddenly appeared and aggressively grabbed Dorney. Cameron dragged the terrified girl away from the streets and houses to a more isolated area. Here he forced his cousin to start kicking Dorney before instructing him to move away. Dorney begged and pleaded with Cameron to just let her go, demanding to know why he was doing this. Yet Cameron ignored her cries and proceeded to rape the young girl. As soon as Cameron had finished his sadistic assault, Dorney seized the chance to break free from his grip and started running. But Cameron quickly caught up to her and stabbed her viciously in the back of the neck before fleeing the scene and leaving her for dead. Dorney was rushed to the hospital and ended up surviving the horrific ordeal, but she was left traumatized and struggled to cope with the psychological impact of the unprovoked attack. Despite her surviving the assault and being able to identify Cameron as her attacker, he remained free and continued his spree of violent crimes. It is unclear why he was not arrested after this attack, but it is possible that the lack of cooperation from witnesses and the fear of retaliation from Cameron and his father's gang played a role in his ability to evade justice. Cameron's attacks seemed entirely random, with victims ranging across ages and genders. No one felt safe. Yet somehow, despite the growing body count and trauma left in his wake, Cameron Wilson continued to walk free. At the end of April 2015, Cameron Wilson committed one of his most brutal and chilling crimes yet, when he raped and murdered 16-year-old Stacy Mahali. Stacy was walking home from school with her friend Abigail Platjes, who was also 16, when they were approached by Cameron and his 13-year-old accomplice. At first, the encounter seemed harmless, but it quickly turned sinister when Cameron pulled out a gun and forced the terrified girls to follow them deeper into an isolated area. Once they were isolated and alone, Cameron proceeded to rape both Stacy and Abigail, while his 13-year-old accomplice stood guard. After the sexual assaults, Cameron handed his accomplice a knife and instructed him to stab both girls. The attackers then placed tires filled with gasoline around the girls' necks and set them alight in an act known as necklacing. This horrific act is often used as a form of vigilante justice in South Africa, but in this case, it was used as a means of torture and murder. As if the necklacing wasn't enough, the attackers also pelted the girls with rocks and bricks, causing further injury and trauma. The girls were then left to burn alive, writhing in agony as the flames consumed them. Stacy suffered an agonizing death from her injuries. She was stabbed multiple times and sustained severe burns across her body. The post-mortem results showed the horrific pain and torture she experienced during her final moments. Somehow, despite her injuries, Abigail managed to survive the barbaric attack. She was able to identify Cameron Wilson as the primary perpetrator, as well as his 13-year-old accomplice. Despite the fear that many in the community had of testifying or pointing out Cameron Wilson, Abigail showed exceptional bravery. She was able to positively identify Cameron as one of their attackers and saw to it that he was arrested for his crimes. Yet inexplicably, despite Abigail's eyewitness testimony and the strong evidence against him, Cameron was released on bail shortly after his arrest. The decision to grant Cameron bail was met with shock and outrage from the community. Many questioned how someone capable of such a heinous crime could be allowed to walk free. Some pointed out that this was evidence that Cameron was indeed untouchable, while others speculated that it was his father's position in the 28's gang and the fear he instilled in the community that allowed Cameron to be released on bail. The real reason for Cameron's release on bail remains unclear, but what is known is that it would prove to be a devastating mistake, as he went on to commit further violent crimes and inflict even more harm on the community. After being released on bail, Cameron Wilson continued his violent spree throughout 2016, leaving a trail of victims in his wake. Over the next few months, complaints and reports of attacks by Cameron streamed into the local police stations on a regular basis. One of his victims was a 22-year-old woman who he attacked after she refused to give him her lighter. The woman was walking alone when Cameron approached her and asked for a lighter. When she said she didn't have one, he became enraged and attacked her, punching and kicking her until she was unconscious. In another incident, Cameron robbed a man at knife point and then stabbed him in the chest when he tried to resist. The man who was robbed and stabbed by Cameron was walking alone at night when he was approached by him. Cameron demanded that the man hand over his belongings, pulling out a knife to intimidate him. The man initially complied, giving Cameron his wallet and phone. However, when Cameron demanded his watch as well, the man refused and tried to fight back. This enraged Cameron, who then stabbed the man in the chest with the knife. The man fell to the ground, bleeding profusely, as Cameron fled the scene with his belongings. The man was rushed to the hospital and luckily survived the attack, but he was left with serious injuries. Another one of Cameron's most brutal attacks was on a woman who was walking alone. Cameron approached her and began beating her with a hammer, leaving her with fractures to her skull and other serious injuries. The woman was left for dead, but luckily, she was found by a passerby who called for help. She was rushed to the hospital and underwent emergency surgery to save her life. The attack was completely unprovoked and highlighted Cameron's disregard for human life. He seemed to take pleasure in inflicting pain and suffering on others, and his attacks were becoming increasingly violent. In September 2016, Cameron Wilson committed the crime that would finally lead to his downfall: the brutal rape and murder of 18-year-old Nikita Moore. On the night of September 10, 2016, Lakita told her father she was going out to a friend's birthday party. It was the last time he would see his daughter alive. The next morning, a woman walking her dog in a field near 8th Avenue discovered Lakita's lifeless body. The young woman was completely naked, her body riddled with stab wounds. Investigators would later determine that Lakita had been stabbed a staggering 98 times, with dozens of wounds to her chest, back, and stomach. Her face was brutally beaten, and her jaw shattered. But worst of all, her breasts and genitals had been viciously mutilated. Parts of her intimate anatomy had been sliced away entirely. Blood spatter evidence suggested a frenzied attack. Lakita appeared to have desperately tried to flee for her life, but her killer chased her down and dragged her back to the murder scene. Drag marks, along with defensive wounds on Lakita's hands, painted a picture of a horrific, prolonged ordeal with Lakita desperately fighting for her life. As news of Lakita's murder spread through the community, shock and grief gave way to outrage and despair. Family and friends were left reeling at the incomprehensible cruelty of her death. Lakita's mother, Shireen, fell into a catatonic state and had to be sedated. Her father, Andrew, was so overwhelmed that he couldn't bring himself to identify her body. The task fell to Lakita's aunt, who nearly collapsed at the sight of her brutalized niece. Determined to find Lakita's killer, detectives began interviewing her family and friends. One of the first people they spoke to was Lakita's 16-year-old sister, Mercia. Mercia revealed critical information that would lead investigators straight to Cameron Wilson. Lakita and Cameron had known each other for several years before her murder. In fact, Cameron was the cousin of Lakita's sister Mercia's boyfriend. He would often visit the Moore household to spend time with his cousin, and it was during these visits that he first met Lakita. Initially, their interactions seemed friendly, but over time Cameron began to develop an obsessive interest in Lakita. Mercia told detectives that in the weeks before her murder, Cameron had begun relentlessly pursuing Lakita. He bombarded her with explicit text messages and threatened her when she refused to date him. Mercia recounted a chilling incident the day before Lakita's death, when an enraged Cameron barged into their home and grabbed Lakita, holding a knife to her throat. He warned there would be consequences if she continued to reject him. On the day of her murder, Cameron once again showed up at the Moore residence, uninvited and clearly intoxicated. He confronted Lakita and warned her not to attend the party that night, as he didn't want her around other guys. Shaken but undeterred, Lakita still went to the party, not wanting Cameron's threats to control her life. It was a decision that would prove fatal. Mercia told detectives that she had been at the same party as Lakita on the night of her death. They arrived at the party at around 8 p.m. The Valhall Park Civic Center was already packed with young people dancing and socializing. Colorful lights flashed across the room as music pumped from the speakers. Lakita quickly spotted her friends and made her way over to them, greeting them with hugs and laughter. Shortly after Lakita arrived, Cameron Wilson showed up uninvited. He immediately sought out Lakita and tried to pull her aside to talk. Witnesses reported that Cameron seemed agitated and angry, grabbing Lakita's arm and yelling at her over the loud music. Lakita looked visibly shaken and tried to pull away from him. Mercia noticed the commotion and rushed over to intervene. She got in between Cameron and Lakita, telling Cameron to leave her sister alone. A heated argument ensued, with Cameron shouting over Mercia's objections. At one point, he shoved Mercia aside and grabbed Lakita by the hair, trying to drag her towards the exit. Other partygoers took notice of the escalating situation and stepped in to help. A group of Lakita's male friends confronted Cameron, pushing him away from Lakita and telling him to get out. Enraged, Cameron shouted over the music that Lakita belonged to him and threatened to act as he pleased towards her. He then stormed out of the party, glaring at Lakita as he left. At some point during the night, Cameron had made his way back into the party, and witnesses recounted seeing him speaking to Lakita. They said that Lakita appeared upset but resigned, and after a tense conversation, she was seen leaving the party with Cameron, although reluctantly. Mercia, who had kept a close eye on her sister the entire evening, grew concerned when she saw Lakita heading out with Cameron. She quickly caught up to them outside and confronted Cameron, asking where he was taking her sister. According to Mercia's later testimony, Cameron seemed agitated and defensive when she approached them. He told Mercia that he and Lakita were just going to get some box wine from a nearby liquor store and that it was none of her business. Mercia found this odd, as the liquor stores would have been closed at that hour. Sensing something was off, Mercia pleaded with Lakita not to go with Cameron. She reminded her sister of Cameron's earlier threats and controlling behavior, urging her to come back inside with her where it was safe. But Lakita, perhaps not wanting to cause a scene or underestimating the danger she was in, brushed off Mercia's concerns. Lakita assured Mercia that she would be fine and that she'd be back soon. She told her sister to go back inside and enjoy the rest of the party. Mercia, still uneasy, asked Lakita to promise to call her if anything happened or if she needed help. Lakita agreed and then walked off into the night with Cameron. That was the last time Mercia would see her sister alive. She would later deeply regret not doing more to stop Lakita from leaving with Cameron that night, and the guilt would haunt her for years to come. Police believe that after leaving the party with Lakita, Cameron took her to a secluded field near 8th Avenue. It was there that he brutally raped and murdered her, subjecting her to hours of unimaginable torture. Lakita fought back valiantly, but was ultimately overpowered by her murderer's rage. After hours of unimaginable torment, Cameron left Lakita's battered, lifeless body exposed in that field, discarded like trash. He calmly walked away from the scene, leaving behind a trail of blood and horror. As if Lakita Moore's brutal murder wasn't horrifying enough, the Cape Flats community was dealt another devastating blow the very next day. On September 11, 2016, just hours after Lakita's body was discovered, a passerby stumbled upon the lifeless body of 20-year-old Xavier Bester in a field not far from where Lakita had been killed. Xavier was a neighbor of the Moore family and lived with his mother and sister in the area. He was known to be acquainted with both Lakita and Cameron Wilson. In fact, some residents whispered that Xavier had been romantically involved with Lakita, although her family denied this. Detectives noted the eerie similarities between Xavier's murder and Lakita's. Like Lakita, Xavier had been stabbed multiple times and left in a secluded area. The proximity of the two crime scenes and the timing of the murders raised suspicions that the cases were connected. As investigators dug deeper, a chilling theory emerged. Several witnesses came forward claiming they had seen Xavier at the same party Lakita had attended the night before. Some even recalled seeing him arguing with Cameron Wilson outside the venue. Following the discoveries of Lakita Moore and Xavier Bester's bodies, the pressure mounted on law enforcement to apprehend Cameron Wilson. Detectives worked tirelessly to gather evidence and build a case against him, knowing that he posed a grave threat to the community. After an intense manhunt, Cameron was finally tracked down and arrested on September 12, 2016. As he was taken into custody, he showed no remorse or concern, smirking at officers and seeming almost amused by the situation. Despite the mounting evidence against him, Cameron maintained his innocence in all the crimes he was accused of. For each murder charge, he had a different story or alibi. In the case of Lakita Moore, Cameron claimed that on the night of her murder, he had been at home with his mother, watching movies and playing video games. Cameron's mother, Sylvia Wilson, staunchly defended her son, insisting that he had been with her the entire evening and could not have committed the crime. When confronted with eyewitness accounts placing him at the party with Lakita and leaving with her shortly before she was killed, Cameron changed his story. He now claimed that while he had been with Lakita that night, it was actually his friend, Xavier Bester, who had killed her in a fit of jealous rage. Cameron alleged that he had tried to stop Xavier but was unable to prevent the murder. For the murder of Alfonso Fonroyen, Cameron claimed that he had been in a different part of town at the time, visiting a friend. He insisted that he had no motive to kill Alfonso, and that the witnesses who had identified him were mistaken. In Stacy Mohel's case, Cameron's alibi was that he was at a family gathering when the crime occurred. He suggested that the police look into Stacy's boyfriend as a possible suspect, claiming that he had heard rumors of domestic violence. When faced with the testimony of his 13-year-old accomplice, Cameron then tried to shift the blame to the young boy and insisted that it was he who had murdered Stacy. Regarding the killing of Toy Herstaber, Cameron maintained that he had never even met the victim. He accused the police of fabricating evidence against him and claimed that he was being framed for a crime he didn't commit. As for Ernest Erasmus's murder, Cameron initially claimed that he had been out of town visiting relatives when the killing happened. However, when presented with evidence placing him at the scene, he changed his story. Cameron now alleged that Ernest had actually attacked him first, and that he had acted in self-defense. The sheer number of alibis and contradictory statements Cameron provided strained credulity. Investigators found it highly unlikely that he could have been in so many different places at the time of the murders, or that so many people would have motives to frame him. As the investigation progressed, the full extent of Cameron's alleged crimes came to light. He was charged with a total of 15 counts, including the 5 murders, as well as multiple counts of rape, attempted murder, assault, and illegal possession of firearms. Throughout his court appearances, Cameron maintained a shockingly dismissive attitude. He laughed, rolled his eyes, and made sarcastic comments, showing no regard for the lives he had destroyed or the pain he had inflicted on countless families. When the charges against him were read, Cameron smirked and pleaded not guilty to each count, despite the overwhelming evidence against him. In June 2017, after a lengthy and emotionally charged trial, Cameron Wilson was found guilty of 13 out of the 15 charges brought against him. The charges included 5 counts of murder, attempted murder, rape, and illegal possession of firearms. The courtroom was packed with family members of the victims, who wept and held each other as the verdict was read. For many, it was a bittersweet moment. Justice had been served, but it could never bring back their loved ones. As the judge announced the guilty verdicts, the gallery erupted in a mix of emotions. Some cried tears of relief, while others shouted angrily at Cameron, calling him a monster and a coward. Amidst the chaos, Cameron began to clap slowly, a smirk spreading across his face before he turned to the gallery, saying that at least he was still alive. For the 5 murder charges, Cameron received 5 life sentences. He was also given an additional 15 years for the attempted murder of Ernest Erasmus, as well as several years for each count of rape and illegal possession of firearms. In total, Cameron Wilson was sentenced to 5 life terms plus an additional 71 years in prison. The judge made it clear that the sentences would run concurrently, meaning that Cameron Wilson would become eligible for parole after just 25 years. For a man who had committed such heinous crimes and shown no remorse, the possibility of release seemed far too lenient. There was also frustration and anger over the fact that several other crimes Cameron was suspected of committing never made it to trial. Investigators had uncovered evidence linking him to at least 3 more murders and several rapes, but key witnesses were too terrified to testify against him, fearing retaliation from Cameron's associates. As Cameron was led out of the courtroom, he turned to face the gallery one last time. With a final, taunting grin, he blew a kiss to the crowd, reveling in their anguish and disbelief.